Hey everybody, so this is the presentation for EthBerlin. The title of the presentation is Baking Utility into NFTs, How to Create Value with Non-Fungible Tokens Beyond Simple Scarcity. So the purpose of this talk is to explore different crypto economic models for non-fungible tokens that don't solely depend on there only being a limited number of these tokens. So my name is Chris Robison. I'm a community manager for Horde, where we are enabling true ownership of video games. So the premise of this talk is that video games are the original virtual economies, and there's a lot that we can learn from them. So the agenda for today is we're first going to talk about what a non-fungible token is. This is the only presentation on non-fungible tokens during EthBerlin. So we're going to just catch everyone up, get everyone on the same page. Then we're going to go ahead and jump into what has currently been the most pervasive model for generating revenue with NFTs, and that's creating scarcity or producing collectibles. We're going to go ahead and talk about why that's not necessarily the most viable business model or strategy moving forward and dive into the economics of that. Then we're going to talk about 3 different opportunities for how we can produce value using NFTs, and we're going to take these as hints from the video game world and see how we can overlay them onto the crypto world. And so those 3 opportunities are how to create productivity using NFTs, how to design over gaps in ecosystems with NFTs, and how to coordinate specialization among different specialists or different people with different specializations using NFTs. So the introduction is, what is an NFT anyway? An NFT stands for a non-fungible token, and this is a token that cannot be replaced by an identical digital asset or utility. So what does that mean practically speaking? Here are a few examples. So we can look at a house token, a virtual loan, or video game armor. Each one of these represents something that's very unique and is non-fungible. That means, for example, if you have 2 tokens and each token represents one house in the physical world, and you exchange those tokens for each other, you don't get an equal value traded. In fact, the new token that you acquire is a house in a completely different neighborhood with a different layout, with different neighbors, with a different view. It's an entirely different token altogether. And so this is very different when we compare it to something like Ether. If you have 2 Ethers and you trade them for each other, the value is the same. One Ether is not worth more than another Ether. They're very fungible. So a house token, maybe a virtual loan, has different credit ratings, or perhaps there's a different risk profile associated with it, different period for how long the loan is taken out for, and so all those are unique to each individual loan. And same with video game armor. There might be a whole history tracked to that piece of armor. It might have been owned by a professional gamer, and so there's provenance to that piece of armor. It could also be damaged in particular battles, meaning that some armor is more damaged than others or stronger than others depending on its history. So the problem that we're really diving into in this talk is that NFTs are new, and we're trying to figure out where do we biddle NFTs to generate value. So some things to acknowledge in that problem are that NFTs are just one tool, and they can be combined with many other tools. And in fact, there's a vast landscape of different combinations. Furthermore, the landscape is constantly changing. And because of all of this, most use cases for NFTs haven't been created yet. And you can see over here on the right a CryptoKitty on a game board. CryptoKitties, that was the first non-fungible token collectible to be produced. And so it sort of made the first play, and everyone else is following suit after it, trying to figure out where it can fit in. So if we're talking about how to produce value with NFTs, then we could look at 3 different drivers of values in the NFT space. The first is utility. So if an NFT has utility, it's useful, profitable, or beneficial in some way, and this is an objective attribute. It's true for all individuals who would be in a similar situation. They would be able to use that NFT with the same level of usefulness and be able to be just as profitable as anyone else. The next value driver is entertainment. And entertainment is technically a type of utility. However, we're separating it out a little bit because it's highly subjective to the individual. What I find entertaining and what you find entertaining might be completely different. Last, we have speculation. And with speculation, an individual would be buying an NFT as an investment with the hopes of returning some kind of gain, but also operating under the assumption that there might be a risk of loss. This doesn't really have much to do with the individual who is doing the speculation. It is almost entirely dependent on other individuals. So for this talk, we are focusing just on utility, that usefulness and profitability as an objective attribute. So the current model that's been used so far to drive value to NFTs has been scarcity. However, moving forward, I don't believe that this is necessarily a viable business model, because strictly using scarcity in combination with no other tools or instruments is a monopolistic strategy. And the spoiler here is that that doesn't work by itself. So, what is a monopolistic strategy? Well, we can look at what happens when a monopoly enters a new market in the goal of returning a high profit. They will always produce a smaller quantity of goods, which is artificial scarcity, at a higher price than a perfectly competitive market would. So what does that look like in practical terms? Here we can look at a competitive market versus a monopoly. So in the competitive market, we can see that the price and quantity of goods that are produced and the rate that they're sold at hits an equilibrium with the market. A monopoly, on the other hand, is producing a much smaller quantity of goods at a much higher price, as we saw in that quote. But why is that? The gray boxes represent the revenue in each one of these markets, and as you can see, the area of the gray box in the competitive market is much larger than the gray box of the monopoly. So more revenue is generated in a competitive market than a monopoly. So why would a monopoly not just produce the same amount that a competitive market would? Because there are costs associated with producing any good. And this is the same for NFTs. Even with NFTs, there are developmental costs, artistic design costs, there are even daily costs with just keeping your website up and running. And so if we take into consideration the costs associated in each one of these markets, and this is sort of oversimplified, but it does drive the point home, we can see that a monopoly producing a lower quantity of goods at a higher price will actually return a higher profit. So just looking at the timeline here of when NFTs started and where they're at now in terms of what that market looks like, we can take a step back and look at when CryptoKitties first came on the scene at ETH Waterloo. They were the first collectible. And so you could argue that they went for a high premium and they clogged up the Ethereum network. There was a lot of demand for them simply because they were really adorable and super cool. Another interesting way to think about it is they simply had a monopoly on the collectibles market. So even though there were more people who wanted to buy them than there were collectibles or CryptoKitties available, they weren't able to purchase them necessarily, so they ended up buying them at a very high price. And so CryptoKitties ended up making quite a bit of money. There are a lot of projects now that are also trying to follow suit with the collectible ecosystem or the collectible strategy. And so they're all hoping to produce a lower quantity of goods at a higher price, because if they do that, then they make quite a bit of money. However, that's not necessarily how the market works at this point. Not each one of these projects is isolated in their own silos. In fact, now every collectible is competing for scarcity. They're all in the same marketplace. So if you start seeing one collectible getting too expensive, it's hard to get too attached to it or be forced to purchase it, because you're not being forced to purchase the only collectible that's out there like you were when CryptoKitties came out. In fact, you can just jump over to a different collectible altogether and hope that you're entering another collectible market before that one blows up. So just a week or two ago, TechCrunch published an article titled "Why the Next CryptoKitties Mania Won't Be About Collectibles." And I think this demonstrates it pretty well, and I very much agree with the thesis of this article. So moving on to the first opportunity for how we can generate value using NFTs in a more reliable way, and that is examining productivity. How can you use a non-fungible token to be productive? So in the video game world, there are different pieces of content, such as items in the game, and you can break down how valuable or how productive each one of those items are in the game by looking at their cost and utility. So here we have two different items. We have a single sword and we have a double sword. We can see that the single sword can be purchased for 100 loot, And on average, over the course of 10 hours of gameplay, you can be expected to generate 200 more loot using that sword in battle. So, coincidentally, the double sword costs 200 loot. Alternatively, a person could outright buy that double sword for 0.1 ETH. Now, why would they do that? Well, if you look at the utility, you can see that over an average of 10 hours of gameplay, you would actually produce 500 loot. And so it's about 2.5 times more powerful or more productive than that single sword. So a player in gameplay might have an experience that looks something like this. They begin the game and they're given 100 loot. They instantly go to the market and they pick themselves up a single sword. Then they take that sword to battle to fight dragons. After the first hour of gameplay, they might generate 20 loot, and then at that point, they have a decision to make. Is that a fun experience? If it is, then they'll do that 10 more times over, so they'll play for another 10 hours until they generate that 200 loot, and then they'll go to the market and buy themselves that double sword. However, if the experience is just okay, maybe they want to augment it and make it more exciting in some way, then they would go to the market and just buy the double sword for 0.1 ETH. So you have two different decision models here for how the player can choose to play the game. And the important information to look at here in comparing the two decisions are what the player spent in each one of their decisions. So in the first decision, where they enjoyed playing the game, they spent 10 hours of their time. In the second decision, where they wanted to augment their gameplay, they spent 0.1 ETH. And so we can kind of break it down in these terms, where they're making a decision between earning the sword versus outright buying the sword. And when they buy the sword, we can estimate that they value their time at least 0.01 ETH per hour. And they value that time in the hopes of returning a productive level or a productive rate of 30 more loot per hour than they were previously earning. Now, there are projects in the blockchain space that are also trying to create productive models using non-fungible tokens, or at least with unique tokens. And so one of these projects is Dharma, where an investor can go to a marketplace and they can buy debt from somebody who needs to take out a loan, maybe for starting a new venture or for purchasing a home. And when you look at the experience of that investor, it looks very similar to a player's gameplay. They can choose to work and earn income over the course of, say, 6 months, or they can go out and purchase some debt that will last 6 months. And so there's an opportunity cost there of approximately 10 ETH over the course of 6 months. Roughly speaking, there is an amortization schedule, but in general terms, that's about the opportunity cost. And the return that they're hoping to get is 15% per year. So if we compare video games with crypto economics, we can see that there is an upside to both of them in purchasing items or non-fungible tokens, or however you want to abstract that idea. There is one important difference to make between the upside of a video game versus the upside to a marketplace like Dharma, and that is that in video games, that upside, that return, is guaranteed, because as long as you play the average of 10 hours of gameplay, you're going to earn that extra 30 loot per hour, because that's just how the game is written. With Dharma, that 15% doesn't come guaranteed. The reason you're getting 15% on your investment is because there is a potential downside where the borrower can default on that debt, and so that's a risk. Now, that's not to say that there isn't any risk in video games, because there are. You could end up spending a bunch of money or a bunch of ETH in a really exciting game, but then over time it becomes unpopular, your friends aren't playing it anymore, and it feels a bit like a waste of money. So that's just something to keep in mind. I'm just going to skip this slide. So the next opportunity for creating value using NFTs is when considering design gaps in ecosystems. So we're going to explore how NFTs can be used to create subversive institutions. So a design gap is a failed or forgotten institution, or an exploit, in this case, in a game. So design gaps can prevent players from achieving certain objectives, or they can enable players to to do unexpected things. And so these can be solved for or leveraged by utilizing in-game items. So what would be an example of that? So here is a scene from a game in Halo that shows an exploit whereby a player has lodged themselves in a wall where nobody else can reach them, but they're able to shoot and attack everyone else, therefore giving them an unfair advantage. So how did they achieve that? Well, they found a warthog and they drove it to an approximate location. When they got to that location, they used the exit vehicle command to then lodge themselves in that wall. So they needed to use that item in a way it wasn't meant for to get themselves to a certain exploit in the game. Other exploits in games can come in more economic forms. So in this example, there is a game, Ultima Online, that is a massive multiplayer online game. In that game, a bug was found in the game's codebase that allowed for near unlimited amounts of gold to be readily available for any player. Gold was the medium of exchange in the game, and so when that happened, it became completely worthless in the ecosystem. Players, in an effort to solve this on their own without the help of the designers, discovered that there was a limited amount of horse dung in the game that was left there by the designers just for fun. So they quickly began using horse dung as the new currency in the game. When I was building this presentation, I couldn't quite come across, or I wasn't able to find any projects in the space that exactly demonstrated a subversive design that I was hoping to communicate. And so for the purposes of this talk, I produced a project with my brother and a very talented developer, Jasper, who is out of Amsterdam. We produced this app to demonstrate this point. So this app is called NFTs. So it's creating non-fungible tokens using Twitter. And the way it works is you log into our portal through Twitter, same as you normally would, and you go ahead and you type out a tweet. You go ahead and hit submit and sign a transaction on the blockchain. And as soon as that transaction is verified, the tweet is tweeted from your account. The NFTs Twitter account then retweets it for everyone to see. And you are given a token of that tweet in your wallet that is unique to that string. So nobody else can now tweet that exact string that you just tweeted and create a token from it. And so what's the point of this? It's kind of hard to say because this is just sort of experimental. That's what the point of this talk is just to initiate or inspire certain ideas. But what could NFTs be? Perhaps it could be the horse dung of Twitter. Okay, so the next method of creating value using a non-fungible token that we're going to talk about, and the last one for the talk, is specialization. How we can use NFTs to bind people together in special ways that have different specializations. So specialization is when players leverage different skills to work together to achieve some common goal. So specialization can usually emerge around a particular item, which on its own would be useless, but through the collaboration of multiple players can generate value for everybody. And so here's an example. Here's an example of Mario Party, where Wario is the coin collector and Yoshi is the boat driver. Together they're working this item, the boat and parachute, in collaboration to collect tokens and hopefully win the game, the race. And so that collaboration looks something like this. Returning to Dharma that we looked at earlier, Dharma also leverages multiple people specializations. So there is a debt token that's created, but the way that it is created to generate the most value is in collaboration with 4 different parties.
There are 4 types of actors in the system: debtors, creditors, underwriters, and relayers. A debtor is a
So that video goes into describing what each one of them does. I'm just going to skip over that because we're sort of low on time here. But basically, it looks something like this. All 4 parties come together around this piece of debt to produce some kind of value. And so you can see that there are parallels here between what we see in a game versus what we see in the crypto ecosystem. It's not the only project doing something like this. Trust Token.
Here's how you create tokens.
Is tokenizing assets. So when you tokenize an asset, there has to be an owner of the asset, and the asset might be a piece of rental property. The owner then hands it over to a trust, which is managed by a fiduciary, and that fiduciary is then legally bound to do whatever the homeowner asks them to do. So if the homeowner asks them to tokenize it, then they do tokenize it, and they can distribute the tokens to beneficiaries, who then have legal enforcement to tell the fiduciary what to do with the home, such as who to rent it out to, or who to hire as a cleaning service if they decide to Airbnb it out, things like that. And so once again, we see this collaboration of specializations around one central token or asset being the home to produce value for everybody in the system. Okay, that's it, with the exception of a few extra ideas to take home with you. These are more self-explanatory, so they don't need their whole section, but some other ways that we see items being valued or generating utility in video games that could be easily transferred over to the crypto ecosystem are in these 6. So keys. Players must hold an item to access something. Non-tradables, such as achievements and badges, can't be transferred among players, but they lock players into a certain ecosystem, binding them socially with that. Bundles are when multiple items are packaged together into one larger item, such as a card pack, and this helps sort of diversify the risk or excitement that comes with gameplay. Gifting is also a very popular way to create utility with games. If you have an ecosystem that has a social norm or where it's socially enforced to give gifts, then the items themselves don't necessarily need to be productive or have any inherent utility on their own. It's the fact that somebody is giving you a gift that is creating social value, and so that's the utility of that item. User-generated items are another great way to create utility with items, and in a system where there's user-generated content, typically the game designer is providing players with basic building blocks, and then they put those building blocks together to create something unique. And the last way is custom modifications like skins. And so these are just ways that players are able to differentiate themselves among their peers when playing games, is they can customize their character to make them look cool in different ways. So thank you very much for listening to this presentation. Please follow us on Twitter at HordeExchange, and I am at CBobRobison.